So listen, what I'm going to talk about tonight is as we start to have organizations get bigger, and we're trying to do Agile at a higher level, we're trying to really figure out how to adapt at market speed all the way up to the enterprise. You know, this is the Scrum meetup. We talk about Scrum Works. I don't know if you guys are doing Scrum at scale or looking at some of the other sort of scaled Scrum models and how that's helping scale. But it's really an interesting sort of conversation around how is strategic planning and strategy execution is actually improving the organizations that you're in. And I think most of the places that we're going into, we're not actually executing strategy a whole lot faster. We're able to execute slices of projects faster, but we're still seeing a ton of drag in our ability to really pivot and change our mind in the market really fast. Is that consistent with what y'all are seeing? What kinds of challenges are you seeing in your organizations about getting, like, how long is your strategic planning cycle in your organization? You guys are budgeting now for what? For 2021 or 2020? For things that get executed in late 2020? Is your capacity already booked through the end of this year? Some people are through the end of next year? Okay. So what kinds of things are going wrong with strategic planning? What's the current state of it? This kind of concept of fire and forget. We come up with a big upfront design on the strategy, a big upfront execution plan. We're going to go after this market. Here's what we're going to have to do. Here's your funding. Here's your budget. And then we throw that over the wall, and we just expect it to go run it on its own. Is anybody doing anything really different than that? You made a little bit of a face. Yeah. Yeah, so most places are doing big fire and forget type things. The concept of when we do that, the delivery organizations, the execution organizations, probably from product manager through product owner all the way down into delivery, becomes more of an order-taking sort of model, where we're not really collaboratively defining what we're going to do. There's not a lot of feedback loops. It's kind of heading down a path. We're just order taking and trying to execute as more and more work gets shoved into the system. We find out when we get into that we have an inability to course correct. Once a project started, you guys ever cancel projects or redirect projects once you get started? No? Sometimes? So there tends to be a lot of inertia for a project once it gets started to keep going. And what that leads to, this sort of combination of big upfront order taking, fire and forget, once a project starts it never stops, it leads to behaviors in organizations where we end up working on 10 times more stuff than we have capacity for. We never estimate our projects right up front. People want to get their projects started because once they get it started, it won't get canceled. So they try to shove stuff in and get things started, even if we don't really have capacity to deliver it. And we end up breaking our ability to execute projects at all in the organization. We end up with technical debt. We have all kinds of interesting problems. So not only is our strategy not adaptable, but it actually damages our ability to adapt in the execution phase. Does that resonate with y'all? So that's what I want to talk about. Is this interesting to talk about? Cool. Cool. What's going on and why the way that we planned work in the past, why the way that we did strategic planning in the past is that the projects that we're doing, we're chasing faster moving problems with harder to execute solutions. How many of y'all are doing some sort of a digital transformation where you're having to connect, to talk about digital, adding technology, adding interconnectedness to everything. So every project now has 57 interdependencies with other systems, and they're all happening at the same time. Makes the projects a lot harder, but they're also at the same time trying to get stuff on the web or get stuff out to the mobile device or get stuff out to some sort of a client, a consumable client, where we want to be able to launch stuff every 2 weeks or launch stuff every month, but we're building way more complicated technology stacks. So that kind of taking place makes it harder to even execute that way. And there's also a really interesting thing. Back when we started building systems 30 years ago, we tended to know what the problem was we were solving. We were rewriting an order management problem. We were automating a process that existed and was pretty well defined in the organization. That's not what we're doing today. Today we're inventing new markets, and we're making all kinds of assumptions about whether it's the right market for the organization to go after, and if we're going to get the revenue and benefit from the market that we want to get. There's all kinds of assumptions about who's the right customer and what is a customer-shaped hole. Is that a term you guys are familiar with, the customer-shaped hole? What's the customer-shaped hole in the market that I'm building product for? And do I really understand the customer-shaped hole in the market that I'm building toward? In some cases, we're actually inventing customer-shaped holes. You guys have heard about customer development or market development? We're actually inventing things that people didn't know they needed with the products that we're building. we don't know if we're solving the profitable problems to solve. And a problem is profitable when solving it makes money for us and gets the customer to want to buy more of it. So sometimes we're solving things that are broken, but solving it doesn't advance our ability to earn more money or be stickier with the customer or stay around. And we have no idea what our solutions are. So you tie all these things together, we end up with strategies that are fire and forget, they're capacity unaware, they're wrong, they're based on a lot of faulty assumptions, and we don't even know what else is going to be coming in when we commit. So a lot of organizations are committing up front, completely in ambiguity, to a strategy that may or may not be the right strategy. Does that sound familiar? And so what we end up doing is just pinning our ears back and going and building code as fast as we can build it and trying to survive in chaos. But we're adding all this agile stuff. We're making all this investment in technology. We're making all this investment in process work, and we're not improving our ability to actually respond to the market. So what we talk about is the strategy planning process is broken, the strategy process is broken. What is strategy?
What's your plan for how you're going to be successful?
A plan for how you're going to be successful? Any other thoughts on what a strategy is? How you're going to take on a project? Okay. So it's interesting. A lot of times strategy gets articulated as let's go be more adaptable. Let's go capture more of that market. Our strategy might be a market-facing strategy. We don't talk a lot about the plan or method desired to bring about that desired future. So that was a good answer. A lot of people think the strategy is we're going to win by having more of this. But what do you do on Monday morning to get there? Tends to be a really big gap in most people's perception of strategy. And so if you remember back in the old GE days, there was a guy named Jack Welch that was running Jack Welch, and people used to quote, we're just going to work harder. We're going to outwork our competition. We're going to find a place where we have a competitive advantage. We're just going to work harder. That's a really difficult strategy to execute, right? Because we don't know what to actually go do. Why do we need strategies? Why are strategies important? What's that?
It gives you direction.
It gives you direction. Why is direction important?
Funding and customer satisfaction.
Funny, we're operating with scarce resource, right? We can't do everything. The projects are hard to do, so we have to be able to target our funding at getting to an outcome that we're getting to. How much time do y'all spend in your IT organizations really talking about how what you're doing connects to strategy? How much adaptability do you have in the work that you're doing to pivot if you learn that there's some sort of a gap in our understanding of the solution or if it's the right problem or not? Are you guys building and getting feedback and adapting the projects you're doing as you're going along? Y'all are making those trade-offs early? Okay. Are you able to, and we talked about this, are you able to kill projects where they don't fit? Do you guys get your budget sort of peanut butter spread? I got $400 million last year, I'm getting $400 million this year? Are you really, really targeting how you're focusing your funding every year? Projects are targeted. Once you've funded the project, from the time they fund it to when you actually start the project, what is the duration in that? What is the span on that typically?
It depends. We rank all of our projects on a priority score, and so based on the priority score your project gets. So if you have a priority score less than, I want to say 7 out of 10, you have a slim chance of getting your project started, period. And a 10 might be a couple months. It kind of depends on the discovery process and official approval of funding.
What do they do that score on? How do they rank those things?
There's a lot of factors. Some of it is how it's going to help the markets or hotels. It's customer facing. I don't know all the criteria, but it's to kind of help so that there's not pet projects that are done over higher actual business functional projects.
Okay. And is that model working pretty well? It's interesting watching a lot of places we walk into, they're not super sophisticated in understanding their strategy and articulating it in an actionable way. So everybody shows up with projects, they rank order them based on ROI or some multi-utility attribute theory model. And if you get the right score and you know how to game it, you can get your project moved up to the top of the stack. If you have the right influencers or executive sponsorship, you can move stuff up to the top of the stack. Still doesn't make them super adaptable once you start them and pivot them. But if you can, the later that you can plan it to delivery and the shorter you can make the project, the more adaptability you end up with, right? But that's not always the case in a lot of organizations. Anybody else, any of y'all have like really, really long project cycles, like from when you start the funding to when you actually get to start working on it? Do you have a lot of delay in that? Are we solving a problem here that doesn't exist? Y'all are staring at me like I'm crazy, so I'm kind of wondering.
I have worked in the past on a project where it took about 2 months to get the funding. The touch time to get the work done was about 30 weeks.
Yeah.
Well, if you're looking at values for
Crazy. I know one of our clients up in Minneapolis, and they were actually doing strategic planning the last 2 weeks. They're doing budgeting for projects in the next 2 weeks for projects they're going to do in 2020. But the projects from 2019 they're currently working on won't all be finished at the end of 2019 because they didn't start at the beginning. They'll have projects running 6 months into 2020, so they're a year out from being able to start something they're budgeting for today. And so the concern is we're building these fast execution engines, but we're not changing the way that we plan work, and we're not able to take advantage of these fast execution engines. Or we're building fast execution engines, but we're still actually doing project-based funding, and so we're not laser focusing investment in the most important places. Those are two challenges that my hypothesis is that exist from the way that we do financial planning and the way we plan out strategies. Is that true at all for you guys? Cool. Okay. So what are some ideas around how we can adapt our funding models or adapt our strategies to be able to operate faster? What are some things that you think we could do in the market to be able to more closely align understanding a problem, building adaptability into it as we're executing, working through a bunch of assumptions faster? Because I think what a lot of people are trying to do is they're trying to get all the answers to all the questions before they release a project into the system. That's where a lot of that delay comes from. They're trying to make sure it's the next most important one to work on.
So I think you hinted at it a minute ago. It's the fund teams, and I would add to that you empower product owners to make those decisions. If you've got a strategic outcome that you're looking for, say 6, 12, 18 months out, if you empower the product owner to pivot, but they don't have to have every change order funded, then the team keeps working instead of pause. We have to stay.
Are y'all doing that now?
Yeah.
So have you guys heard the concept of OKRs, outcomes and key results? Give a product owner an area of the business or a problem space to solve in, and they have stable capacity. You fund the capacity and the outcomes, not projects within it. How many people are doing that type of stuff today? Just sort of surveying. Oh, okay, Cox Auto. Well, yeah, okay. Yeah, where like Isaac Hogue and some of those guys are all over there. Yep, got it. We worked with you guys before. Yeah. Okay, very cool. So are any of y'all doing that sort of work where you've got stable capacity around a part of the business and you fund that capacity and outcomes, and then the product owner's kind of empowered within it to make a lot of decisions?
So we've got that situation, right? We have teams that are established teams and they're not changing, and funding doesn't decide that, and it is what it is at this point. And we have product owners that will bring in work and say this is what we're doing. The problem we run into is almost feel like the opposite, where they have the ability to pivot, and a lot of times they do pivot, and we see the opposite side of that problem of teams will get halfway through work and pivot off of that and have that wasted capacity of we spent 3 months on a project, and now that project has to get shelved and it's useless 6 months down the road.
Yeah, that's the flip side of empowered teams I was going to get to in a minute. There's a book out there called Turn the Ship Around. David Marquet, have you guys seen that? And one of the things that he talks about in there that I think gets missed a lot is that you delegate authority within the competence and clarity of the organization you're delivering it to, and you create context for that group to be successful. So a lot of times we're empowering teams, but we haven't created clarity on the strategic direction. And so you've got a lot of teams that have gone too far the other way that we see pivoting inside of little boundaries without really being focused on delivering to OKRs. So he's not being held accountable to some higher level capability based or customer based outcome. He's just coming up with great ideas and pushing them into the system. And so that's cool, but it's not necessarily the right way to spend the money either, right? So you got to be able to combine the two things. You got to be able to have the empowerment, but you also be super focused on the outcome that you're responsible for and how you measure against that. Because the fact that you can pivot doesn't mean that you should. It's got to be very intentional. And I think that stack of, is this the right market? Is it the right customer? Is it the right problem? Do we have the right solution? And are we executing on it right? I think that stack becomes really important to begin to understand. And we got to be intentional, like managing that whole stack. Because if we're not intentional about managing and validating all those assumptions as we go, you're either just running off like crazy, or even though you've got a product owner that's completely funded, you still have the fire and run sort of thing going on where you don't get to adapt and change it at all. So finding the right balance around that is really important, and managing and validating all those assumptions becomes really important. So, okay. So what is a good strategy? Give me an example of some strategies that you guys have worked with or in your organizations. What are your strategies? Like if you're doing work in your organization, you're spending the company's money, shouldn't you be able to articulate the strategies you're helping execute?
To increase market share.
Okay. What are some other strategies you're executing?
Reduce time to market.
Okay.
Greenfield projects, capture the market.
Capture the market? Okay.
So we've kind of saturated in our main market, right? And so our main strategy right now is how do we find other vertical markets to get into within that? And that's kind of what we're doing now is our main goal.
Okay. So what's interesting to me is some of these strategies. I don't know if you've read the book Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, but it's really interesting to kind of get underneath it. Increase market share is an example of a bad strategy in that book, because, okay, what do you do on Monday? Right? So I give somebody that, but how do I fund that? What I do is I create a multi-utility attribute theory model, and somebody goes in and says, well, this is going to help us capture some market. And so we just take every project that somebody can make a case that it's increasing market share, and those get moved to the top of the stack. But it's not a focused, aligned sort of thing. There's not an overarching alignment of all that work. So you end up doing things and not gaining the benefit. In a lot of cases, we don't even hold the organization accountable for achieving. Like, how are you guys measuring increased market share? Is that something somebody's responsible for and getting in trouble?
It's communicated, but it's at a lot higher level.
Yeah.
It doesn't really impact our day-to-day. We don't see that measurement. And hey, this went out, 2,100 things occurred, it got this much better, but it doesn't necessarily map one-to-one. There's inference to the result.
About 15 years ago, I went into the CIO of a company downtown that makes paper, and I had the annual report from the CEO of the company, and I had his IT budget, and I asked him, can you talk to me about how these things that were promised are being accomplished by these projects? And he goes, that's ridiculous. We couldn't do that. We've never been held accountable to that sort of standard. I think we have tighter. I think over 15 years we've gotten better and better at that. But I think strategies still tend to be very ambiguous, very unclear to execute, and it's really hard to take the execution capacity and tie it cleanly to what we're doing and how it's achieving those things. I think that's still really hard. And I do think people that know how to game the model. I was at a large agricultural manufacturing finance company this week. And they were joking about how last year the way you got projects into the system was to make them be compliance projects. And 2 years before that, they were customer satisfaction projects. Same projects, same pitches, same exact stuff. But if you know how to package it up in the theme of the day, it would get marked into there. But none of them actually got measured on their ability to move the needle or how it would actually do that, right? So the things that belong in a good strategy are a diagnosis of the problem. We got to be able to talk about what the actual problem is. We have to be able to have a guiding principle or a guiding policy for dealing with the challenge. How are we going to close the gap that we have? And we need a set of coherent actions designed to carry out the guiding policy. That's the plan part. But having a plan that we don't have ties to the policy or the rules of the game that we're doing to close the gap that we've identified, the gap between our ability to execute and where we need to in order to achieve the strategy, that stuff has to be pretty clear. And that lack of connectivity, I think, is a problem. And when you have ambiguity, it's very, very hard to pivot until you get done, right? So I think the lack of clarity in the assumptions and the lack of connectedness of the work that we're doing makes it really hard for organizations to pivot. I think this connectedness, this clarity becomes more and more important as we have to move faster and faster, particularly when projects start to compete for shared resource with each other. So what happens is you've got some of those basic platform things, and you've got 30 projects all competing for that platform now, right? Because we have all these integrated products, and it's very hard to prioritize the individual feature request against that platform because they're all number ones. You guys have heard that conversation? So we almost have to start to, how do we start to prioritize at a higher level? And this is a fallback from fire and forget and get my thing started because it won't get killed. So we have to get all those projects into the pipe on day one. So that's like a broken part of the process. And if working on 1,000 things at once or being pulled in 20 directions what resonates with you, that is not a result of bad execution or bad technology. That's a result of bad connecting to strategy, right? Because you can't get away from the dependencies, because you got to solve the problems you got to solve. This digital interactive stuff is stuff that has to happen, right? So how do we going to solve that problem? And I don't think it's necessarily by getting better at how we execute software. I think that's an important component of it, but I think it's insufficient. So I'm going to talk about my diagnosis. I'm going to apply good strategy to the problems of how we do strategy today. Okay? So one of the problems that we have is it isn't possible to predict the market effectively ahead of time. It isn't possible to have the right answers 18 months ahead of time today. You guys agree with that? So a planning system that requires us to have the right answer 18 months ahead of time or 12 months ahead of time or 6 months ahead of time, and certainly in the competitive edge of our organizations, anything that requires that is not going to work, right? The other thing is, because that's not possible, because we can't know it, then we can't change the problem by changing just the strategy thing. We have to become the kind of company that can respond in real time to changing circumstances. I went through this thing, and it's like, I want to be rich, I want to do that, and it's how do I get rich? But it's how do you become the kind of man that can become rich, right? There's a different thing here. So it's not how do we reduce the ambiguity or plan better or get better. It's how do we become the kinds of companies that can respond to ambiguity and uncertainty at a really high rate. Does that make sense? So when I tell this joke about, it's not a joke actually, but I tell this story about coming home and my son is building a brick mailbox around where our mailbox is. And I said, what are you doing? And he goes, well, my sister, Brittany, is learning to drive. When she backs down the driveway, she's knocked the mailbox over a few times. So I'm going to build a brick mailbox so she can't knock the mailbox over anymore. And I go, I think you might be solving the wrong problem. Right? So when we go you go read the literature right now about trying to change how we do strategic planning and how we're trying to respond to markets. And I think things like SAFE and all that sort of stuff, that's useful, but I think it's only useful within the context of solving the right class of problems. So the diagnosis is, I think we're solving the wrong problems sometimes. I think it's a multi-layered problem, and all three things have to be related together. So that's the diagnosis. So the guiding policies are, we have to be able to connect outcomes to markets, customers, problems, and solutions. We have to be very explicit about how the solutions we're implementing tie all the way back up to outcomes. If we can't do that, then we don't have the baseline to be able to make trade-offs and understand where we're moving. We also don't provide the context for that product owner to make meaningful trade-offs. So either they're frozen and doing everything they think they might need to do while they're in there, and I'm not saying that's happening, but that's at one end of the spectrum, or they're changing their mind every day because they're just doing the newest cool thing that comes along. Because it's not tied explicitly back to an outcome. This talking about outcomes and key results that you see sort of going on in the industry today, that's what they're trying to get to. It's not very well articulated. Because we don't tend to tie our stacks all up. There's an interesting sort of thing that if I looked at a story, using just some sort of I looked at a story, I'm going to go stories, features, and epics, like that stack of requirements. And if I were to look at a story and say a feature is just a bigger, less ambiguous, or a more ambiguous story, and an epic's just a really big, ambiguous story. They're all the same nature thing. They're all sort of solving an execution problem. How many of y'all treat features, epics, and stories like that kind of thing? They're just execution placeholders that are more or less ambiguous as you move up or down the stack, right? So I think features should be about customers and problems. We should be explicitly able to communicate how that feature is solving a problem for a customer. It's not just a bigger, more ambiguous thing. It's a different nature of conversation. And is this really the next most important problem to solve for that customer? And how will I measure that? And I think epics are about connecting customers to markets, to outcomes in the market. I think epics are about making investment decisions. And when we change the nature of the conversation, I now have a way to engage with the business and create connection from epics all the way down to stories. But I don't think that we do that in most of the case. I think we kind of get an idea into IT, and we have really vague things, kind of vague things, really specific things. So we're not having the conversations with the context and the control that allows us to even make the right types of trade-off decisions and prioritization. If I had 50 things coming into my central group, and I knew which epic they were connected to, and at the strategy level, I had prioritized my value propositions within my outcomes, I could tell you which one of those things to work on next. Because the most important one is the one that releases the most value in the enterprise. But it's really hard to have a system where that's super clear to make those trade-offs in most organizations. Right? You just have people just getting crushed all the time. So we make strategies that are capacity and dependency unaware. We make strategies that don't allow us to prioritize the value propositions, and it's not because we're not smart, it's because the design of our organization doesn't let us see that. So there's another thing that happens where the assumptions about our outcomes, our markets, our customers, our problems, and our solutions aren't articulated clearly. So we work on something and we build it all the way through and deliver it, and we can't find out that our assumptions were true or false until we get to the end. Just working with a client last week, and they were working on some functionality, and the audit group stopped them from continuing to work on it because they needed to build in all this ability to track who was using it and all the security stuff before they could test it in the market. And so they spent like 6 weeks, 3 sprints worth of work adding in all this compliance-related stuff to get the feature in front of one customer for the first time to find out it wasn't the next most important feature. It wasn't what the customer wanted. So rather than be really, really clear about what assumptions they were making and then doing the right amount of work based on what assumptions they had validated, it's just a runaway train. And they don't find out till it's too late. Some of that might be, maybe that's some of what you experience sometimes. And what if we could be really, really explicit that we have not yet validated the assumption. This is even a problem that we want to solve for a customer. My feature level validation isn't even clear. What's the least expensive way to drive that assumption down before I go do all the other stuff around it? And
It'd be tough when you make deliver software
yeah,
demo to demonstrate deliver value.
yep,
The release strategy is bundle these 6 features and go to market.
yeah, yeah, that's right. So the challenge there is, I want to do these things. I want to make these trade-offs. I want to be really, really clear. But I only get 4 drop points a year to drop code out to the customer because I have these big release trains running. I only get 4 drop points a year, and if I miss this one, it's going to be another 3 months. So I'm just going to build everything that it might be and get it on the train and then test it afterwards. Right? So that's not a strategic planning problem, and that's not an execution problem. That's somewhere in the middle about how we manage the flow of work through the organization. The rules about validating that, there's got to be less expensive ways to validate that than have to build it all before you get there. But because the assumptions aren't explicit and the rules of validating that aren't clear, we end up having it, you're operating within the system that exists, right? So we talk about creating opportunities to make decisions to change the plan. I know these assumptions are unclear. I want to have an opportunity to go test it. How can I go test it inexpensively before I commit the whole thing, even given the constraints of 4 drops a year or whatever it is? Are you guys on 4 or 6 or monthly?
No, it's actually more a problem of a mindset from product
Yeah.
that says this isn't like minimum viable product.
Yes.
It's more like minimum marketable product. It's this big instead of
Yeah. And what I want to be able to do in the organization is be able to have conversations at the funding level, not at the execution level, that say, but what assumptions are behind that? Because I want to drive down those assumptions before you dig too deeply into it, right? And so what they're doing, this is that fire and forget. This is, I've got the money, I need to go build it. I promised it would ship in this release, we need to get it shipped.
and I have this money, so I can spend
And I have this money to spend. I used to do this game called the Coffee Maker game. Some of you may have played it at some point. I think Doug has taught it before. But this really interesting thing with the, did you ever teach that in the fundamentals class? With the Coffee Maker game, we would have them identify, we'd have them come up with a strategy for their coffee maker. I want to be a low-cost coffee maker. I want to be a high-fashion coffee maker. I want to be a high-tech coffee maker. I want to be able to be started remotely from the bed. A lot of the things that we made up in that game now actually exist, and I probably should have patented much of it. I might not be here. But then we would give them a list of, they'd make their list of features they want to add, and then we would like arbitrarily size them just to play the game. And then I would say, okay, identify that set of features as absolutely minimally necessary to deliver on your value proposition, and you have 15 points worth of capacity. So tell me what your release plan looks like. And every one of them, every single time, would spend 15 points of capacity, even though they needed less than that to deliver on their value proposition. Right? It's a way that we think. And what we should be thinking is, how do I validate my assumptions before I spend another dollar? But our governance models don't require us to do that. Our governance models are tracking red, yellow, green on, am I getting the date? Am I getting all the scope that was promised? Right? So we're not designing the types of companies that know how to operate that way. We're actually in conflict with what we want to do. Create information to inform those decisions. So here's the decision I need to make. How do I get to it fast? And then we need to deliver in a way that we can make those changes inexpensively. So how do I go find out really, really cheap whether this feature's needed or not? Go validate it before I build the rest of it. And if it's a bad idea, find a different way to build it or solve a different problem. Right? So this fabric, and then reevaluate the portfolio at different levels frequently whenever your assumptions are wrong. So if my customer assumptions are wrong or my market assumptions are wrong, there was a client here in town, a financial services company, that had a project. Doug worked with this team too. It's really cool that you're here, Doug. Thank you. Doug worked with this team too. They had a project that they'd been working on for a year and a half, millions of dollars invested, and had actually foundationally demonstrated there was no market for the product. There was no customer, but it was a project that was funded, that had a sponsor, and the sponsor, the executive sponsor, the product management guy, got paid based on whether they delivered the projects in their portfolio or not. Isn't that crazy? You guys ever seen anything like that? Right? That's amazing, right? So we're talking about creating companies that can exist and operate in ambiguity and stuff like that, and we think this Agile stuff is solving it. We think this Scrum, TDD, containers, DevOps is solving it. But the problem is way outside of that container. Is that kind of cool? Is that interesting? So what do we do? I'm going to give you 3 high-level actions, and these are real things. And we're starting to see these sorts of things happen in organizations. How many of y'all have been around like a product-driven organization plan or a capability-driven organization plan, where you're creating foundationally stable parts of the organization, but they're built around like a product, or they're built around a customer, and you're funding both the business and the technology, the run and the build and the grow stuff is all in one budget with a single owner who's running it like a P&L. And they have certain outcomes they need to get to, and they're running it that way. We're starting to see some organizations designed that way.
That's how Optum operates.
Okay. It's more and more common that's happening, but if it does the funding model like actually support delivery in that, or are we still dealing with the other sorts of problems of high level commitment? So there's other challenges sometimes within that. We have to integrate technology and business into cohesive collaborative teams that can deliver frequently. There's an interesting thing that happens here. Have y'all read Drive, Autonomy, Mastery, and Purpose, how teams get integrated, how teams get highly engaged? Get value-focused teams that have some control, get highly engaged teams that care about that outcome. We're kind of getting to highly engaged teams, and Agile is supposed to do that for us. But when those teams are operating in pure order taker mode and can't actually connect to the strategies and the outcomes, you don't really get that true engagement driving around the But if I form a product-shaped organization...
Yeah. But let me kind of add to your comment there about connecting the strategy and engaged teams. What's interesting is that, because I've been doing a lot of job interviewing lately, I talk to large companies and they want to be more like a startup.
Yeah.
And I think what they are potentially missing is that at a startup, of course, it's much smaller, and teams feel much more connected to
absolutely.
The
yeah.
and the organization, and so they are engaged, they're working hard.
That's,
a lot of innovation going on, and that is lost in these organizations.
yeah, because they get so far disconnected, and they're in order taker mode, and they're scrambling like crazy to operate with no actual ability to influence the work they have to do. Right? And so you end up with this breakdown of connection to the work that you're doing, and you end up with unengaged teams just showing up, cashing their check, and doing the work every day. And it's a shame because we're wasting brilliant people's passion for the problem. And you can build that passion. We talk about we're doing a product-based organization, and we have dedicated teams, they're aligned this way, but they don't actually have the ability to provide the feedback to validate the different points and influence the course of the product.
But then, like, how do we as team members really demand that we get better connected? Like, having this...
So that becomes the super interesting thing. I'll tell you what we do as a firm is I don't think you can solve it from the team level. This is the myth of the Scrum Master, by the way, in my mind. When you talk about the Scrum Master's job is to remove the impediments and solve all these problems for the team, they don't have the agency to go back and say, we're not going to do this until we start doing epics right and connecting it to customers and outcomes. They can't solve that problem. So I think at a certain level, you can start educating on it. But we need to educate not within the IT organization, but within the business side. We talk about having really tightly cohesive business and technology integrated teams, and they're not. Even on those teams, they talk about the business and IT, right? They're not the product team that's solving this problem for the customer. So they're organizational design things that have to happen. You guys have done some of that in some cases, right? So I think you guys are way ahead of the game in some cases. You had a great consultant help you with some of that early on. I think that's important. That was supposed to be funny. I'm sorry. But I think we still lack it because we haven't connected all the way from execution all the way to how we connect the strategy stuff. I think if we don't start at the top with identifying everything has to be connected, we have the structures in place to do it, but we don't leverage them that way. And then we don't get the right engagement because what's really fascinating is the business doesn't understand that if they don't prioritize those epics and those value propositions based on business value, they're not actually setting the strategy for how we're going to deliver. The real strategy is, I'm going to let some developer on a team decide what's getting delivered in the next release, right? So you begin to have those types of conversations. I don't want to be responsible for making that trade-off decision. Let me talk about the model and how it's supposed to execute and the level that decision needs to be made. That's the language that we use when we're talking about it. You've got to find a friendly ear. You've got to influence your way up, right? Because you can't dictate it.
And I will also say there's, so after a team has delivered something, being able to have that feedback loop on measuring, well, did we improve our customer satisfaction
Yeah.
score, or more people got through the purchase funnel, or whatever it may be.
Critical.
Having that feedback come back.
Yeah.
So they can-
So if I form a team around the product and I fund all the stuff within that product or that capability or that value stream, a known thing, and my OKRs, my outcomes, are defined for the performance of that chunk. And I take these agile teams I'm building and I put them in there and really align them with the business people and hold them all accountable for moving the needle on the outcomes within that product. You get this result. It's very doable. And the thing is, everybody's doing some aspect of it in most organizations, but it's not as intentionally connected as this, right? So it's really interesting going into an organization that's doing OKRs and really good strategic planning, but none of that bleeds its way into the value proposition prioritization. None of it shows up in the epics. And it's like, it's no more work to connect the stuff that you're already doing, but we don't understand how to tie it all together. And so we end up with epic features and stories that are just vaguer and vaguer chunks of requirements. So we want to tie that together. So form organizations around products. Explain to them how to get the teams inside, how they can align, how the work they're doing aligns with moving the needle on the outcomes. And then make work flow through the organization, but you've got a cadence of review where you're continually looking at burning down those assumptions at the different levels. You're continually validating. I could see a scorecard in a large organization, which was critical capability that needs to be developed for an organization. Here's the state of the assumptions, and here's the rate that we're burning it down. And if we're doing a lot of granular work way downstream, and we haven't validated market assumptions, or we haven't validated it's the right problem, I think it'd be very interesting. So I could have a feature that was red because I'm operating on a problem that isn't validated yet. So I want to put the energy into the organization to validate that's the right feature, the right problem for the right customer. And that's the pivoting I want. I want my product owner to feel compelled to go drive that value down. And I want them to have permission to prove that it's the wrong answer and pull that feature out and put another one in. So if you're very intentional about how you do the requirements and how you do the governance, you're already forming teams around the right things in a lot of cases. If you're still project-based and doing project-based funding, this is a non-starter, right? That's like a major failure mode.
Are you really able to, isn't that always or frequently the 10,000-pound gorilla in the room?
Yeah, aren't most of us getting away from pure project-based funding?
But I think a related problem, though, is this for forming the organizations around capabilities, and I had the good fortune to work with Dennis' brother Dean on this capability-based teams.
It's a love fest here, by the way. Big family.
But how do you handle the impact on the existing, hierarchical organization with, silos and even maybe empires where staff is aligned around architecture or something, not around capabilities? You're talking about these resources are going over here. How do you get that to happen?
So we're getting much better at having those conversations in organizations, and there's dollars around it. There's also case studies. Look up product-driven organizations, some of the ones that have done it. Like right now, there's a large automobile manufacturer in Dearborn, Michigan, that's going through a global restructuring to a product-driven organization. And took 2 years to have the conversations to get them to actually do the work necessary to do it. But what drove their need to do it, and this is going to sound horrible, they needed a 20% reduction in headcount. And when you're not orchestrated, when you're project-driven, and you're across all these silos and all this stuff, there's a bunch of people whose job is to move a piece of paper from here to here, or to maintain and orchestrate problems. So the answer is companies like Bain. Bain's the one that's coming in and telling this story in a lot of places. They're coming in and saying, listen, the way you get rid of all that overhead and orchestration is you form stable teams around major business problems and you fund those solutions. So maybe you need Bain to come in, or us to come in, although we're not having, like somebody that can have that conversation at the executive level. But I think you're starting to see it, and you can point to examples of it. But again, the myth of the Scrum Master, right? There's no Scrum Master that can solve that problem. So the only way that I would know it, if I were running a program, or if I were like a divisional CIO in a place, I would be capturing data of the costs to the organization. I would pretend like if I could run the model right, what it looks like. There's actually a simulation that we're working on, which is showing the difference between what it costs to run the system one way and what it costs to run the system a different way, and the economics behind that. So I think you could start to drive some data where you can demonstrate it. I think finding case studies where it's working would be the first conversation to have. What we did with our client up in Grand Rapids, and the one that I was just with in Des Moines, we're flying them to Dearborn to meet with the executive team there. We're flying executives up to meet with executives, have the conversations at that level, because they won't listen to the rank and file on it. But if you don't solve that problem, if you don't become the type of organization that can operate in an agile fashion, it doesn't matter how good we get at Scrum. Does that make sense? It doesn't matter how good we get at automated testing. Yeah. At an organizational level, it doesn't matter how good we get at this if we don't create the organizations that can exploit it, and then teach the strategic planning process how to take advantage of the fact that you got to move faster, but you can't move faster until we build these systems that are responsive, that can listen, where we can deliver frequently, validate assumptions, and those become first-class citizens. I want to be measuring not red, yellow, green, and how fast I'm getting my project done, my CPI, cost performance index, my schedule performance index. I want to see how well you're doing burning your assumptions down in the organization against that model of, am I solving the right types of problems? Am I executing at the rate that I said I would? Those become interesting to me conversations to have. So I've one last slide, but these make sense. So this is hard to do, but a lot of people are doing this, forming organizations around something meaningful. Here's the other interesting challenge, Doug, that I think early on we did wrong in some cases that we're much clearer about. You don't have to do the whole organization. The stuff that's at the customer edge is often easier to shift faster because you have to move. They're under pressure. They're failing to deliver today, and they have leaders that see that. So sometimes it's easier to redesign this at the edge than it is in the back office. So Horizon 2, Horizon 3 type products are things you might be able to form stable teams around, because if you can't compete there, you're going to get your ass handed to you. I probably should say that a different way, but you're not going to be able to compete, right? You're not going to be able to win in the market if you don't solve, and you can't solve that problem. Man, I'm telling you, the number of people that go and put SAFe in, there's nothing wrong with SAFe, but going and putting SAFe in an organization that isn't designed around the products, and that you don't have any ability to apply the feedback, you're not validating stuff, and SAFe doesn't actually drive integration with the business problem. It doesn't create shared accountability for delivering an outcome, right? It's a set of methods that is part of the problem, part of the answer, but it's just a small part of the answer. We put it in because we have the ability to influence and make it happen, but in and of itself, it actually looks like we spend a lot of money, change a lot of behavior, create a lot of noise in the system, and not have improved our ability to deliver on business outcomes, right? So this isn't horrible. A little bit fast. So we have to become the kind of company that can achieve outcomes, fixing the strategic planning problem, being able to deal with assumptions and ambiguity in an organization, is not just about getting better at Scrum and delivery practices. You guys good with that? There's a story to be told around we have to build organizations that integrate technology and the business together, totally focused on strategic outcomes. The best way that we know how to do that in most cases is around products or capabilities or services or value streams. There's some way to build integrated things, create measurable outcomes for that integrated team, and they will tribe around it and resolve it together. What's interesting is you probably have examples of doing this in all of your organizations when there was a giant single project that had to be delivered. And you formed an integrated team around it. Everybody worked together to deliver that project, right? So the things that have to move fast, we already know what the pattern looks like. It shouldn't be the disruption, that shouldn't be the exception pattern, it should be the pattern for delivering stuff in the organization. We already know how to do these integrated teams. We have to be continuously improving our understanding of the market and our customers and the performance of the solutions. If we don't have the right sort of market sensing stuff built in to test the performance of our outcomes and our key results and things that we're testing, if we're not doing that all the time, we have no idea if our projects are being successful. We're just sending money after what we think are good ideas. We have no way to drive the assumptions down in the market. So we have to build that. What's interesting to me is people that get this today, you see them doing like big data analytics and driving a lot of interesting stuff out of, and again, they're doing all this, but they're not connecting it back to adapting their portfolio of investments as they're going. Like they actually have it's knowable in the company that's a bad feature or a bad project or a bad market, but we're not using that data to adapt because we don't have the sort of model of learning and adaptability built into the execution model. So I think all three of those things have to be woven together for us to be successful at an enterprise level. So that's my last slide. We've got plenty of time. And I actually had an exercise I was going to run on this to try to show those two things. It's not quite ready for prime time, but I wanted to get some feedback on the story, the order that I told it, and I'll answer any questions around it, where we're doing it successfully, because we are doing this in places now. What's interesting is we're doing it with places that already understand it. This is beginning to try to tell the story to people that are on the edge of it and start to get them to be able to tell the story. Does that make sense? So we're doing it where we have the agency to do it. We're trying to broaden the understanding of this because this makes a huge difference in organizations' ability to deliver.
So, in regards to understanding the market and customers, there's studying the analytics that you have access to. Then there's spending time with customers, and product owners are really getting squeezed.
It's a ridiculous assumption that a product owner can keep the backlogs perfectly clear all the time, connect all. So my belief is a product owner is probably responsible about from a feature down to a story. If you look at that row of execution to solution to problem to customer, I probably need my product owner involved down there. There's still a role for product management or some other role, which is collaboratively doing solution and customer, solution and problem, and then going customer market. So those two things have to overlap. There's absolutely still a need for that. And the guy from Silicon Valley Product Group has a really nice book. Marty Kagan has a really nice book that talks about the different roles there. But this belief that a product owner in an enterprise can do all that, it's absurd. And it's being promoted by big consulting companies right now. Get rid of all your overhead, get rid of all your other product people. The product owner can do it all. And the product owner can do it all when they have a totally autonomous team and then in real-time contact with the customer and they can deliver every 2 weeks and they don't have to do anything else and they're collaboratively working with the customer to do that. But the conditions, if the conditions don't exist in your organization for that to happen, the product owner can't do it all. So I believe that there's absolutely a need for product management in most organizations, but it has to be incredibly and intentionally woven together, right? And most organizations, those are very separate. So what about the story? Any other questions on this? Yeah.
I have a question on a slightly different topic.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about validating your assumptions and the ability to pivot and change directions when you find these things out.
Yep.
I come from an organization where I was working on internal tools, customer-facing.
Yeah.
So in our world, we had a concept of ADBB, which was annualized direct business benefit.
Yeah.
Some calculation where they figure out and plan how much value is associated with a certain project.
Right.
And however much ADBB you got, if you were high enough, you were above the line, you got your project work done.
Yeah.
So if you're having these assumptions about the value in what you're delivering, aside from this monetary magical number, but just
Yeah.
value. And the only way to validate your assumption is to deliver it
Yep.
and get feedback. How are you supposed to pivot quickly when let's say it takes 6 months to deliver the feature?
Well, you can't. You can't if it takes 6 months to deliver a feature. So that's this chunk about we've got to be able to deliver smaller and more adaptably. We've got to be able to break the work down and validate stuff. That planning that's sort of probably like a problem solution execution gap. The assumptions, if I can do that really fast, but I'm extremely explicit about the assumption. The assumption is if we put this functionality in, it will improve the performance of that group. I guarantee there's some less expensive way to validate that's true than building the whole thing and shipping it. Right? And so that's the challenge. And that's the craft of product ownership, right? That's the craft of product management, is being able to figure out how do I go validate that less expensively, and if I'm wrong, is my execution happening in a way that I can adapt without it being extremely expensive? Because what you've got in that model is you've made it very expensive to find out and very costly to pivot. That is your governance model. That is your organization telling you how to deliver that. So we have to figure out how to challenge that. And what happens in there is you probably have very vague epics, a little bit clearer features, really clear stories, but they're all the same construct, right? It's not like the epic is, here's what we believe about the market and the customer, the business user that we're solving for and their business problem. There's no empathy around their problem, understanding their process. I can't have conversations around that. So I'm not involved in the feature conversations around problem solution within that context and integrating with them to validate my assumptions around that. And then I'm doing stories, and I'm rapidly delivering stories, but I'm sequencing that work to validate the biggest, most expensive assumptions early and the solution problem ones second. There's a way to use this ability to deliver working tested code every 2 weeks to give me something of measurable value that I can use to validate the most expensive assumptions. I don't think we try to do it in our teams. I go into Scrum teams all the time. We had some of this early on where I've got 5 features in the next release, right? And so a different developer picks up every feature and they're working on all 5 features from day one. Does that ever happen? Right? What that means is there is no adaptability. I'm executing in a way. Even if I wanted to go have the conversation about validating assumptions and doing things, I'm executing in a way that I can't even pivot if you did learn something. Because we haven't sequenced the work and driven our execution to create that adaptability. And this is why it's so important to get really good at Scrum first. Like it critically matters to get good at being able to execute in slices, to create pivot points, to make it inexpensive to change. Then we got to get really good as product owners at figuring out what to validate to drive our assumptions down and sequence the work. So I'm driving down risk early, I'm driving down ambiguity early, right? And we can do most of that within our delivery organizations. We can do most of that. Now once you've got that really nailed, now we can go start the value proposition about how we change the strategic planning process. What's happening for us and some customers, where we've had a chance to do this, is we started here, right? Then we got really good at this, and the last 2 years we've started to get really good at tying it to the top stack. But as a firm, we didn't walk in with that story. We didn't even know that was the nature of the problem. The nature of the problem over time has unveiled itself. You're probably running up against the next set of threshold now as you guys get really mature, right? It's the organizations that kind of get ahead. You're seeing these things in your organizations, which is why we thought this was a relevant conversation for a bigger group. Because it used to be, let's just go get good at Agile. Let's just go do Scrum. Let's get good at Agile. Let's get good at product owner teams and product management, managing dependencies and sequencing work around it. But now it's about how do we exploit that system to really accelerate our ability to achieve our organizational outcomes. And most of you are probably you might not even realize that you're on that path in your organizations, but being extremely clear about it can like help you accelerate that delivery. I got excited there for a second, I'm not sure why.
So in what you just said, you mentioned that a way to create pivot points is to be really strategic about how you sequence.
The order you deliver. And that's within the control of your team.
But if you do that,
Yep.
and let's say you sequence the work and you're only going to work on feature 1 and 2, and then 3 and 4, and then 5 and 6, now you have this additional unallocated capacity. And that is where the challenge comes, because the business is like, well, it only takes 2 developers to deliver this feature. What are the other 8 of them doing?
Right.
So how do you balance that?
Well, a couple of things. One is you ought to get all 8 of them to be able to work on the same feature together. Like learn how to swarm around work and collaborate better, right? There's ways to do that. What's interesting is when we don't have the right technical practices and testing around it, it's actually very hard for 4 people to be sort of in the same code together, right? But if I can check my code in every 2 hours and everybody's doing it at the same time and we're never breaking the build, like that was original XP type stuff, right? That was old FDD stuff for those of you that are older than 50, right? The way we did stuff a long time ago. I could have everybody in the team work, design a feature, build a feature, deploy a feature. And we had practices, you could put everybody working on that feature and get it out there and then validate it. I mean, that was the way that you built software before Scrum was even cool, right? It turns out those are still really good practices, right? But so that thinking gets lost, and that was being built in financial services, trading platform, high performance type things where messing the data up or making a dealer mad or having the feature not be usable was really expensive. So it was just too expensive to build and validate the whole thing at once. And so you did it in little pieces. Those technical practices that are necessary for all those people to swarm on the same code are really important. But we think it's too expensive, or we don't have time to do it, or are you guys doing? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the first thing is get great at delivering chunks at a time. Get great at getting your whole team to swarm on a feature. If you can only get 2 developers in that feature, think about this for a second. I'm the product owner, and I've got 2 teams, and each team is working on 5 features simultaneously. How much freaking burden does that put on that product owner to keep all 5 of those things clear and answer the questions and juggle all the things at the same time? Versus if we were as a team working on getting that one exactly right. And I'm holding context, I'm still thinking about the rest of it, but I'm not granularly in the detail on all 10 of them. How much more fidelity, how much finer could I trade off inside that feature if we learned how to all work on a smaller number of things at the same time? Think about the cognitive load on the testers that are getting stories from 10 different features every other day. And we don't understand why our quality isn't where it should be. We're slowed down, we have really expensive integrations at the end, right? It's super cool for the developer to sit in the room and just write code by himself and not be bothered by anybody. But think about the cognitive load it puts on the organization outside of the developer. Think about the lack of optionality it creates for us to be able to drive down risk and learn. And it becomes really expensive, right? We're solving the wrong problem sometimes.
Dennis, you had a story also earlier that something about priorities. Like when you talk about working on 10 things at once, it sounds like we don't know what is important. And when we're working on 10, we haven't actually gone through the process possibly to prioritize.
Yeah.
And if we could do that, we then also possibly create better options.
That's right, because we could explore what was the most important thing. It would actually force some discipline around what is the most significant thing to do, right? And also, if we're talking about what are the assumptions we have to validate, it creates incredible clarity within the team that's working on that feature.
A lot of what we run into is this whole priority idea, and we're told by our product owners, hey, this is priority, right? Well, the dev teams ask the question, why? Why is this the priority?
Yep.
And a lot of time the answer is, well, somebody asked for it. And that has nothing to do with the value we're actually getting at. This could be a 0 value proposition project.
Yep.
But they've said, well, VIP customer over here said they want this tomorrow.
Yeah.
So this is highest priority. When the dev team thinks, well, if we do this project, that's going to drive revenue up for the next 3 quarters.
Right.
Why is this not higher priority? Why is this not something we should work on?
So I'm going to say something. Are you the product owner on that team? Okay. It's a failure mode on the product owner. The product owner is not making good business decisions. They're not holding their space. They're not being a good steward of the capacity in the team that they're accountable for. They're just order taking. And but that order taking isn't because they're a bad human being. It's because that's how they keep their job and how they're successful and how they don't get beat up organizationally, right? That's why it's a failure mode of the design of the governance model. If we made driving down ambiguity and connecting to OKRs every feature that goes into a team be a first order thing in that governance model, if we measure it and report it, it will change that behavior. We had, and Doug working with Dean, but this was I think before Doug was working with Dean, but one of the things we used to show was doing a capability analysis for an organization that had 5 years of prioritized backlog and mapping it to their capabilities and then doing some analysis of most strategic performance gaps to close. This is a big performance gap that if we got better at, it would help us advance our strategy. This one doesn't really have a huge performance gap. It's not working well. This thing could work better, but it's actually sufficient for what we need today. It's just there's somebody who lives there who is asking for stuff because they see a way to make it better, right? It's a reasonable request. It just isn't super strategic to close that gap. So if we could prioritize the strategic value of closing the gaps, if we could prioritize value propositions first, And so we did this whole scoring. We heat mapped all of the capabilities, all the feature work that was going on. And the guy who was getting all of the work, his stuff was all green, but he had all of the investment for the next year. And he walks through and he goes, why am I getting all the investment for the next year? And they go, because you're the nephew of the guy that owns the company. And nobody wants to piss you off. He goes, well, that's irresponsible, But they'd never had the ability to look at it and have the conversation. They were just rank ordering stuff. And the guy, the sort of one of the key factors on their prioritization model, on their multi-attribute utility theory model, was executive sponsorship. And he had a 1 as executive sponsor. So you automatically like a double multiplier on anything he supported. Because when you made him mad, it made your life difficult. Right? That's a failure mode no Scrum Master can fix, no amount of getting good at Scrum can fix. Right? But what we can do is we can start to report on the cost of that. And I think we can do that within our teams. I think our product owners can do that within our teams while continuing to order take, but begin to create awareness around it.
Yeah, we started doing that a little bit. We started actually tracking. All right, the cost of this development you just had to do for 3 months. That you took the 2 senior developers off of these other projects. You took for this project. This is what you paid for that zero value proposition.
Yep.
And this is here. And we started reporting that out and said, look, this is what that cost. And it seems like that's just never been a thing. Nobody's ever cared about that cost, right? It's development cost. But
Yeah.
we were told, a couple weeks ago that our development cost is 80% of our overhead. Well, yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Now, if you think about this, and it's a design of the system problem, right? That's what I'm saying. You have to become a company that can be agile. It's not about fixing any individual process. It's about how do we start to create a vision of what does it mean to be a company that can be agile. That is a problem where my epics are not being tied up to a value proposition for a customer in a market, right? I don't know what the outcome and key result is. And I, on the development team, or my product owner, who really has no agency to do this, is having to make priority decisions. And what he's doing, he's deciding which project he's going to take on, as opposed to deciding, what he's really deciding is which strategic value proposition we're advancing. And they're not looking at it that way. So when you can connect it, it creates that visibility, right? So which strategic value proposition is being advanced and who should be making that decision? It's not a developer on a team. And in an enterprise, it's not the product owner. It can be the product owner when it's a little tiny autonomous team and they totally control the budget and they make or lose money based on the performance of it because they're a part owner of this small company, right? But it can't be the product owner when they're just an order taker in an organization. So, it's a great question. How does the story come across? Was other than me talking a little bit too fast because I didn't know how long it was going to take and I was kind of pressing to make sure I got it all done. How does the story come across? Where we told it from the top down? Was it insightful, entertaining? Is there anything that you would change? I'm trying to do a little retrospective on the presentation in real time.
Who are you pitching it to?
So at Agile 2019, it's listed as for managers trying to bring strategic alignment within their organizations. So it's not to a developer. It's to somebody at your level or above, right, in an organization who's trying to connect. Oh, that actually hurt. It's all right. It's not the first time I fractured my spine, which is true, unfortunately. Yeah, so it's pitched as for managers and executives responsible for getting the benefits of Agile. And what we're talking a lot about, so the metrics thing is really interesting, to tie into the metrics. We're talking about every Scrum team. We should be able to tie it back up to one of 5 or 6 key business outcomes. I've increased predictability? Have I increased quality? Have I increased time to market, time to ROI? Can I reduce cost per feature delivered? Do I have better market fit, better product fit? Do I have the ability to implement innovations into my stuff? Do I have better employee engagement? So there's some things that we can measure, and everything that we're doing down here should be connecting to one of those, but it only happens if you do the requirement stack right. And what we've been able to do is by making those things are actually interesting to an executive. The number of stories that we did in the last sprint is not interesting, right? So there's all kinds of things that don't matter, but if I can tie it to dollars and business outcomes and make that be my dashboard, now I can start to talk about, we did, it's like doing that sort of forensic mapping to business outcomes that we did with that guy in Texas, where we said, we didn't tell them what to do, they just gave us a prioritized backlog and we just mapped it against their outcomes. And they're like, well, it's stupid that we're working on half this stuff. We didn't prioritize it, we used your model, showed you what you prioritized. We're just showing you what you're working on. They go, well, we need to revisit this. And so what they started doing is they flipped to prioritizing performance gaps inside of capabilities as opposed to a different way to do it. But it just created a different conversation. So yeah, I think the reporting on it is really clear. But go to our website and download like the white paper on, and go to the what do you measure standpoint and think about how to tie that stuff all together. Because that's pretty helpful. And it's available. I think there's a metrics paper out there now as well, but it might not be out there yet. But I think that all becomes really interesting. That's how you start. If you have the right data and the right information, you can start to win those conversations. Being mad about it is not the way to win in an enterprise.
And as far as the audience goes, like, do you really think that this will arm middle managers to go back and have a real influence back in their traditional hierarchical organization?
Start to chip away at it. I mean, this is the level that we entered organizations in most cases and moved up the places we're doing. Although in our biggest client, we started at the CEO level, CIO level. But a lot of places we're coming in like at a middle level and then creating safety and then exposing how to exploit it. So yeah, I think if you can do it really well and then begin to expose the opportunities, I think that middle managers can start to influence that in their organization.
Maybe something they could do to actually try to help make things happen is to encourage their teams to build the outcome measurement capability into their features. Something I'm trying to look for something they can take from this that they can go back and do.
Yeah.
Sort of influence change, rather than just talking about it. What could they do? That comes to mind. I don't know. I think if the flow, if the connection of the three layers, the three problems make sense to you, I think telling that story, getting alignment around it, talking about how we're not taking advantage of the system that we've built, the narrative might be sufficient to get some momentum around it. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm thinking about in an organization, if the managers are truly agile managers, then you're right, that would be their role. Their role would be to recognize that the team, what they're working on is not necessarily delivering what their corporate strategy is. If managers still think of themselves as being product owners, part scrum master, part developer, then this could get turned on its head to, I'm going to go back to how much you.
Yeah, I think I want to start telling the story up rather than down. Yeah, and it's interesting because it's really difficult. We actually had one of the guys, one of our product leads in our organization. You talked about our strategy is to be more agile or to increase market share or to this, and the answer is how do I do that? Well, the answer to how you do that is you go put the system in place. You start to measure against it, and you start to laser focus on things that will move that needle. That's how you do it. So this is actually the strategy, right? But our product guy walked in at a client in Omaha and goes, your strategy is just wrong. You can't just say increase market share, gain more customers, get more customer value. So that's not an effective way to have this conversation either.
But having a value, like with, a KPI, some sort of performance indicator, what that measure of success is.
Yes.
To make it from up top here, kind of waterfall into your epic. Would
Super
help
powerful.
us a lot of times understand, because the developers have ideas where, we try not to tell them how to do things, but we try to tell them what needs to be done, how to, and with that, and I think that's where some of their knowledge is not being utilized.
Yeah, and things become super powerful if you have the discipline up to the epic. I know this is the outcome I'm trying to move. When the conversation with my product owners and my delivery teams is, listen, here's the outcome we're going for, and here's what we think the performance gaps are. How could you guys help us brainstorm around how to solve some of those things? You could get some brilliant ideas. But the other thing you get is you get developers that want to decide how to do stuff because they've been empowered and they're this generation, there's a lot of energy around it. And if you don't give them a valuable place to focus that energy, it will be sort of destructive, or you'll have a lot of turnover at that tier. But if I can create a system where this is the next most important value proposition, let's all get together and talk about it. How are we going to solve for this one? Right? It creates energy, that creates tremendous sense of purpose, even if you don't listen to anything that they say. The fact they were involved in the conversation, understand, is incredibly powerful. Right? Creating this middle tier, creating these empowered teams. I'm on a different slide, but on the other slide, empowered teams was in the middle. That's why I pointed there.
So we see that, and we get, our teams feel empowered, they feel like they have a voice, and they get to make decisions, they get to state decisions.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not those decisions are done or acted upon is a whole other story. But you know what? I feel like what we run into a lot is kind of the curse of the MVP, right? It's you know it'll come down the line of, hey, we need this and we need it right now and we need the quickest thing to it. And that's great and all, but the real solution there is this is a small solution to a small problem when we have a bigger problem that we know of. Why not solve that bigger problem instead of just solving the small problem and solving it again and again and again?
Right.
And we run into that a lot of the teams, you know, the dev teams they feel empowered, like, look, we know the better solution for this. We know how to do this the right way and the more long-term way, but we're not being allowed to do it.
So two parts of that answer for me, and just I don't know a ton about the details, but two parts of it is, one is, if I can talk about the assumptions behind why you believe doing the smaller thing is better than the big thing and get clarity on that, if I can start to drive that out, that's helpful, because now I at least know the language to use to get them to want to do the bigger problem.
Okay.
Right? So that getting under the assumptions is one, because probably they're doing it because they're afraid if they don't get it done right now, they're going to lose their job. Customer complained, they got to solve it right now. This other thing's going to take longer. I've already got this capacity all committed. There's no way that I can do both of them. And sometimes that's the reality. Sometimes that is the right answer. Right? Because I've got something that it would just be better to have the customer pay their bill this month than build it right. Maybe you can find a way to do both, but I think it's interesting to try to get under the assumptions and then use their language to create a context of why they would want to do the bigger thing.
Well, there's a step before MVP that we're currently doing, and our last place did as well, and that's POC, proof of concept.
Yeah.
A lot of times people always drive that that's the minimum, the smallest thing, but that doesn't drive down the assumptions. The idea that MVP will always grow. What we think of MVP as being this big, but the business always thinks it's this big.
Yeah.
Your intermediate step is, how do we take one piece, one problem, how do you do an A/B test and test for lift?
Yeah, exactly.
How do you roll that out as a POC and compare? We do that here in areas fairly well, other areas not as much.
Very cool. Yeah, the challenge of, I had a thought that fired, but then I started listening and I kind of lost it for a second. But the challenge of MVP, when the organization, the way I get money for a project is by getting my things started and staying in there and doing everything I might ever want to do, because you're not doing value proposition decomposition within that. You're doing a big value proposition, getting permission to go own the team for a while with your stable funded team, and you're going to hang on to it as long as possible.
Right.
And really, if that epic, that small thing was not 47 value propositions bundled together, but was each individual sort of thing, then you can start. That's how you define an MVP, is what market problem am I solving? What's the next one? What's the next one? What's the next one? And I think that gets lost sight of, and we're not great at the value proposition decomposition as we're going after that typically. So I'd get better at value proposition decomposition if I could.
So I like your perspective on negating your assumptions for your hypothesis. I think that's a perspective I've never looked at before.
Cool. I think that hierarchy, I mean, we're actually like figuring this out, right, in real time as we're doing this, and we're having tremendous leverage and getting tremendous involvement from the enterprise by getting them to make their hypotheses explicit and then pointing out the risk of having the wrong hypothesis. Some of those at the market customer level are very expensive.
Yeah, I think I've been reading some blogs and stuff like that. A lot more people are talking about, I think, outcome-driven events.
Yeah.
Now, rather than, other approaches 5, 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think as an industry, we're on this journey, right? We all have all the pieces in place. We're on this journey. This is where we're all going to be in 5 years. We're having a different conversation around what it means to be an agile enterprise.
Well, that's good because it's agile.
That's right. That's right. We're growing and learning, right? So thank you. This is the first time that we've done this talk this way in a group and not in a client workshop. Like this is actually, typically what you do is you take some work, and I do this as a workshop, and we start to break the work down as we're doing it. We build the governance models, we talk through it, and it's like a 2-day sort of thing. So it's interesting to try to get the concepts across in 75 minutes, and I really appreciate your patience and your feedback on it. So thanks for your participation.